A crowd bustled through the airport terminal, a chaotic blend of hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, and half-heard conversations. People were rushing to their flights, their lives, their destinations, each person wrapped up in their own world. Some were chatting on their phones, others were sipping overpriced coffee, and a few stared blankly at the departure screens, hoping their flights wouldn't be delayed. It was just another day at the airport, a place where stories collided, yet no one stopped long enough to notice them. Amid the sea of travelers, there was one man who didn't seem to belong. Sitting quietly in the corner, he was easy to overlook. His beard was scruffy, his hair a tangled mess, and his clothes were so worn that they looked as if they'd been through countless storms. A faded hoodie clung to his shoulders, its fabric frayed at the edges, while his jeans were ripped not in the trendy way, but in a way that spoke of years of wear and tear. His shoes, once white, were now gray, with soles so thin they barely held together. People passed by him without a second glance. To them, he was invisible, just another homeless man who had somehow wandered into the terminal. A few travelers glanced his way, their eyes narrowing in discomfort before quickly looking away. A businessman muttered under his breath, clutching his briefcase a little tighter as he walked by. A young mother pulled her child closer, as though the man's mere presence was a threat. But the man didn't seem to notice, or maybe he had just grown used to it. He sat on the cold tile floor, his back resting against the wall, and stared down at his hands. In his lap was a battered notebook, its cover bent and its pages filled with scribbles. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. There was something about him, something that didn't quite fit the image people had of him. It wasn't just his calm demeanor or the way he held the notebook like it was the most valuable thing in the world. It was the look in his eyes, sharp, observant, and filled with a quiet intensity. If anyone had stopped to really look at him, they might have noticed the subtle details that set him apart. The way his posture, despite his ragged appearance, carried a quiet confidence. The way his hands, though calloused, moved with precision and purpose. Or the way he glanced around the terminal, not with the desperation of someone lost, but with the curiosity of someone who saw more than others did. A janitor pushing a mop walked past him, casting a wary glance. "You can't sit here too long," the janitor muttered, not unkindly, but with a tone that carried the weight of routine. The man nodded silently, his expression unchanged. He closed the notebook and tucked it carefully into his tattered backpack, a motion so deliberate it was almost reverent. Then he leaned back against the wall again, his eyes scanning the terminal as though he were waiting for something or someone. Meanwhile, a few feet away, a young woman stood in line at a coffee kiosk. She had been watching the man for several minutes, her curiosity piqued. There was something about him that didn't sit right with her, not in the way he made her uncomfortable, but in the way he seemed out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She noticed how he seemed to fade into the background, yet at the same time, there was an air about him that made it impossible for her to completely look away. As she watched, a man in a suit walked by, nearly tripping over the homeless man's outstretched leg. "Watch it," the man in the suit snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. The homeless man mumbled an apology, pulling his leg back. The businessman shook his head and muttered something under his breath before storming off. The young woman's brow furrowed. Something wasn't adding up. The man didn't react to the businessman's harsh words. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, as though it were fragile, and studied it with a look of deep concentration. From where she stood, the young woman couldn't see what was on the paper, but she could see the way his eyes softened as he looked at it. It was a look of longing, of determination, and of something else, something she couldn't quite place. She wasn't the only one who had noticed him. A security officer stationed nearby was watching the man as well, his gaze sharp and suspicious. The officer's hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup if the man did anything out of line. To the officer, the man was a potential problem, a disruption waiting to happen. The young woman turned her attention back to the coffee kiosk, but her mind was still on the man in the corner. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Who was he? What was he doing here? And why did he seem so at peace, despite everything? As the minutes ticked by, the terminal grew busier. Announcements blared over the loudspeakers, and the sound of rolling luggage filled the air. The man in the corner remained where he was, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around him. He opened his backpack again, this time pulling out a small, worn book. The cover was faded, the title barely legible. He flipped it open and began to read, his lips moving slightly as he did. A child walking past stopped and stared at the man, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, what's he doing?" the child asked, pointing. The mother glanced at the man, her expression tightening. "Don't stare, sweetie," she said, pulling the child away. The man looked up briefly, his eyes meeting the child's. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, kindness, maybe even recognition. He gave the child a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to his book. The child smiled, but his mother hurried him along, her pace quickening as they disappeared into the crowd. The young woman from the coffee kiosk had moved closer now, her curiosity getting the better of her. She didn't want to stare, but she couldn't help herself. There was something about the man that drew her in, something that made her want to know his story. What she didn't know, what no one in that terminal knew, was that the man sitting quietly in the corner wasn't just another homeless drifter. He wasn't a beggar or a troublemaker. He was someone who had once been at the top of the world, someone whose name had been spoken in boardrooms and headlines. Beneath the tattered hoodie and worn-out shoes was a secret, a story that would shake everyone to their core. If only they knew who he really was. The air in the terminal seemed to shift slightly as the man adjusted his position on the floor. A cold draft brushed past him, but he didn't shiver. His stillness was almost unsettling, as if he had mastered the art of fading into the background without completely disappearing. People hurried past him with their rolling suitcases and hurried glances, treating him as little more than part of the scenery. But not everyone could ignore him. At the far end of the terminal, a security officer leaned against a railing, his eyes locked on the man. He tapped his radio lightly, considering whether to call for backup or handle the situation himself. "Homeless guy at gate 7, the officer muttered into his radio, keeping his voice low. "Looks like he's just sitting, but I'll check it out." His partner's voice crackled through the radio. "Don't bother unless he's causing trouble. We've got enough on our hands today." Still, the officer didn't look away. Something about the man seemed off, not threatening, but unusual. His calmness, his quiet confidence, it didn't match his appearance. The officer had seen plenty of drifters and troublemakers pass through the airport, but this one felt different. Meanwhile, the young woman from the coffee kiosk had taken a seat nearby. She pretended to scroll through her phone, but her eyes kept drifting toward the man. There was something almost magnetic about him. It wasn't his appearance, if anything, he looked like someone who had been through more hardships than most people could imagine. No, it was something deeper. Her curiosity grew as she watched him pull out a pen and begin writing in the notebook again. His movements were deliberate, almost methodical. His hand moved across the page with a precision that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. She couldn't see what he was writing, but the intensity on his face was impossible to ignore. "What are you working on?" she thought to herself, resisting the urge to ask out loud. Nearby, a group of teenagers laughed as they walked past, their voices echoing through the terminal. One of them, a boy with a backwards cap, glanced at the man and nudged his friend. "Hey, check it out," he said with a smirk. "Dude looks like he's living here." His friend chuckled, and they both laughed as they walked away. The man didn't react. He kept writing, his pen gliding across the page as if the world around him didn't exist. But the young woman noticed. She saw the way the teenager's laughter made the man's shoulders tense ever so slightly, though he didn't look up. Her heart ached a little. She didn't know why she felt so drawn to him, but something about his quiet dignity made her want to protect him from the world's judgment. "Excuse me, miss, your coffee's ready," the barista called out, pulling her attention back to the counter. She grabbed her cup and took a sip, but her mind was still on the man. By now, the security officer had decided to approach. He straightened his uniform and walked over, his boots clicking against the polished floor. "Hey," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can't stay here all day, you know." The man looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the officer's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man's gaze was steady, unflinching. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet confidence that seemed to catch the officer off guard. "I'm not causing any trouble," the man said calmly. His voice was low and even, with a tone that suggested he wasn't used to raising it. The officer hesitated. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even aggression, but the man's composure threw him off. Still, he couldn't just let him sit there indefinitely. "Look, I get it," the officer said, softening his tone slightly. "But this isn't a shelter. If you don't have a ticket, you can't stay here." The man nodded slowly, as if he understood. He closed his notebook and slid it back into his backpack. "I'll move," he said quietly. As he stood, a few people glanced in his direction, curious about the interaction. The young woman watched closely, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. The man slung his backpack over one shoulder and started to walk away, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The officer watched him for a moment before turning and walking back to his post. He didn't know why, but something about the encounter left him feeling unsettled. The man didn't go far. He found another corner of the terminal, this one near a row of empty seats, and sat down again. He opened his backpack and pulled out the notebook once more, flipping to a page near the back. The young woman, now completely captivated, decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She picked up her coffee and walked over, her footsteps light but deliberate. As she approached, the man looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Hi," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I hope I'm not bothering you." The man shook his head. "Not at all," he said. She hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward his notebook. "I couldn't help but notice you've been writing a lot. Are you working on something?" The man studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then he nodded. "You could say that," he said. She smiled, encouraged by his response. "Are you a writer?" He paused, then gave a small shrug. "I guess I used to be," he said. There was something about the way he said it that made her heart ache. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to push him. Instead, she sat down on one of the empty seats nearby, keeping her distance but making it clear she wasn't leaving. For a few moments, they sat in silence. The man returned to his writing, and the young woman sipped her coffee, sneaking glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like there was something important about him, something she was meant to understand. What she didn't know was that the notebook in his hands contained the plans for a future that would shock the world. Every word he wrote was part of a blueprint for something far bigger than himself. And soon, the world would find out exactly who he was. It wasn't long before trouble found him. Airports, with their security cameras and strict routines, didn't leave much room for anyone who didn't seem to belong. And to most people, he didn't. He wasn't carrying a sleek carry-on suitcase or a laptop bag. He didn't have a ticket sticking out of his pocket or a phone glued to his ear. Instead, he sat quietly on the floor near Gate 7, cradling his battered notebook and tattered backpack as though they were all he had in the world. The clicking of heavy boots echoed through the terminal, each step deliberate and unhurried. It was a sound that always turned heads, signaling authority or, for some, trouble. The man didn't look up, but he felt it. He could sense the weight of the officer's gaze before he even stopped in front of him. "You can't just sit here," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the busy terminal. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his polished black boots stopped inches from the man's outstretched legs. "Move along." The man didn't argue. He didn't look defiant or even annoyed. He simply nodded and began gathering his things. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was used to this kind of interaction. The notebook went into his backpack first, followed by a pen with a cracked barrel. Then, slinging the frayed strap of the bag over his shoulder, he started to stand. But he didn't get far. The officer stepped forward and shoved him back down, his open palm hitting the man's shoulder with enough force to send him sprawling onto the cold tile floor. The notebook slipped out of his bag and skidded a few feet away, its pages splayed open like broken wings. "You don't belong here," the officer spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "Go loiter somewhere else." The man stayed on the ground for a moment, his palms pressed against the tile as he steadied himself. He didn't meet the officer's glare. He didn't say a word. Slowly, he reached for his notebook, his fingers brushing the edge of a page before he pulled it back toward him. Around them, the terminal bustled on as if nothing had happened. Most people didn't even glance their way. A few travelers looked over briefly, their gazes flitting between the officer and the man on the ground before turning back to their phones or boarding passes. To them, it was just another scene, a homeless man getting told off for being somewhere he didn't belong. It was nothing worth interrupting their day over. But not everyone ignored it. By the coffee kiosk, a young woman stood in line, her brow furrowed as she watched the scene unfold. She'd been observing the man for a while, ever since she noticed him sitting quietly in the corner. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the picture people had painted in their minds. And now, as she watched the officer shove him, she felt a pang of anger rise in her chest. "That's not right," she muttered under her breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. The officer loomed over the man, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. "I said move," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. "Or I'll move you myself." Finally, the man looked up. His eyes were calm, unflinching, and carried a quiet intensity that caught the officer off guard. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'll leave." The officer hesitated, just for a moment. There was something about the man's tone, not defiant, not pleading, but composed. It was as if he wasn't afraid, as if he had nothing to lose. "Then get moving," the officer said, stepping back slightly but still watching him closely. The man got to his feet, brushing off his knees. He picked up his notebook and tucked it securely back into his bag. Without another word, he turned and began walking away, his steps slow but deliberate. The young woman couldn't take her eyes off him. She had been watching people all day, travelers rushing past with their stories and their secrets, but none of them had held her attention like this man. There was something about the way he carried himself, even after being pushed down. Something about the way he didn't lash out or argue. It was almost dignified. But there was more to it than that. As he walked away, something about his profile, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his bag seemed familiar. She couldn't place it, but it tugged at the edge of her memory, like a song she'd heard once and couldn't quite remember the lyrics to. Next in line, the barista called, jolting her out of her thoughts. She stepped forward, fumbling with her wallet as she ordered her coffee. But her mind wasn't on her drink. It was on the man who had just been shoved and dismissed as though he were nothing. By now, he had found another corner of the terminal, this one farther from the gates and closer to the large floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. He set his bag down and sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling his notebook out once again. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages until he found where he'd left off. The officer watched him from a distance, muttering into his radio. "That guy's not going to stay out of the way for long," he said. "Keep an eye on him." A second officer glanced over and shrugged. "He's harmless. Just let him sit. We've got bigger problems to deal with." The first officer grunted but didn't respond. Something about the man was bothering him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Meanwhile, the young woman had gotten her coffee and was now sitting at a nearby table, her eyes darting between her phone and the man by the window. She noticed the way his hand moved across the page, writing with a focus that seemed out of place for someone who appeared to have nothing. She wondered what he was writing about. Was it a diary? A letter? A story? She wanted to ask, but she didn't know how to approach him without seeming intrusive. Instead, she just watched, her curiosity growing with each passing minute. Unbeknownst to her, she wasn't the only one paying attention. A businessman sitting a few seats away had noticed the interaction with the officer earlier. Unlike the young woman, his interest wasn't out of concern, it was out of annoyance. "This place is going downhill," he muttered to his colleague, nodding in the direction of the man. "They're letting anyone in these days." The colleague glanced over briefly before returning to his laptop. "Just ignore it. He's not bothering anyone." "Yet," the businessman said, his tone dripping with disdain. "People like that always cause trouble sooner or later." The young woman overheard the comment, her jaw tightening. She wanted to say something, but she held back. Instead, she focused on the man by the window, who was completely oblivious to the judgment being cast his way. What no one in the terminal realized, what even the man himself didn't fully grasp, was that this moment, this seemingly insignificant scene, was just the beginning. The storm was coming. And soon, everyone would know exactly who he was. The man sat near the window, his back straight, eyes fixed on his notebook. The terminal stretched around him, filled with people too wrapped up in their own worlds to notice the weight of the moment or the depth of the man's silence. He wrote with a kind of intensity that seemed almost out of place for someone in his position. His pen moved swiftly, decisively, as if every word mattered. But the coffee kiosk woman couldn't look away. She cradled her cup, her fingers nervously tapping against the paper sleeve, and debated with herself. Should she approach him? Would it be too awkward? Part of her worried he wouldn't even want to talk to her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than what anyone else saw. Across the terminal, the officer who had shoved the man earlier stood with his arms crossed, watching like a hawk. He hated loose ends. People like that man, in his experience, were trouble waiting to happen. He'd seen it 100 times before: wanderers, drifters, and the occasional con artist trying to make a scene. But this one was different. "Still there," the officer muttered into his radio. "Guy's just sitting again. Writing or something." "Leave it," came the reply. "If he's not bothering anyone, he's fine." The officer frowned. Something about this didn't sit right. Meanwhile, the businessman seated nearby grew visibly agitated. His irritation simmered just below the surface, barely concealed by his faux-polished demeanor. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The young woman from the coffee kiosk heard him but pretended she hadn't. She didn't want to engage. She didn't want to be pulled into his negativity. Instead, she shifted her chair slightly, angling herself so she could keep the man in her line of sight. The businessman wasn't done, though. He leaned toward his colleague and added, "I pay good money to fly out of places like this. You'd think they'd keep it a little more respectable." The colleague barely looked up from his phone. "What do you expect them to do?" He's not hurting anyone. For now, the businessman replied, his voice dripping with disdain. But people like that don't just sit quietly. They're always after something. His words stung, even though they weren't directed at her. The young woman felt anger bubbling up inside her. She glanced at the man again, who remained oblivious, lost in his writing. Did he hear those words? Did he care? She didn't know. But what she did know was that the businessman was wrong. The man at the window didn't have the look of someone after something. If anything, he looked like someone who'd already had everything taken away from him, and yet, somehow, he still carried himself with an unshakable quiet dignity. "Excuse me," a voice said, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was the barista from the coffee kiosk, her hands full of a fresh batch of stirrers and napkins. "Sorry to bother you, but do you need anything else?" The young woman shook her head quickly. "No, I'm good. Thanks." The barista nodded and went back to her work, but the brief interruption gave the young woman the push she needed. She stood, clutching her coffee, and began walking toward the man. Her heart raced with every step. What would she say? How would he respond? She didn't know, but she couldn't let her curiosity go unanswered any longer. When she reached him, she hesitated for a moment before clearing her throat softly. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative but kind. The man looked up, his eyes calm and steady. "Sorry to bother you," she continued quickly. I saw what happened earlier. Are you okay?" The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said simply. She hesitated. "I couldn't help but notice you've been writing a lot. Are you working on something?" For the first time, his gaze softened slightly. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge her intentions. Then he nodded. "Something like that." She smiled, encouraged by his response. "Are you a writer?" The man tilted his head, considering the question. "Not exactly," he said after a pause. She wanted to ask more but decided not to push. Instead, she gestured to the seat near him. "Do you mind if I sit?" He shook his head. "Go ahead." As she sat down, the businessman from earlier glanced their way, his scowl deepening. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. The young woman ignored him. "So," she said, turning back to the man, "what's the notebook for? If you don't mind me asking." The man hesitated, then opened the notebook and turned it toward her. The pages were filled with writing, tidy, precise, and deliberate. There were charts, diagrams, and what looked like mathematical formulas scattered between the paragraphs. She blinked, surprised. "What is all this?" The man gave a small smile, the first flicker of emotion she'd seen from him. "Plans," he said simply. "Plans for what?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He closed the notebook gently, his expression turning thoughtful. "For something that matters," he said quietly. Before she could ask more, the officer from earlier approached again, his jaw tight. "What did I tell you?" he barked, his tone sharp. The man looked up at him calmly. "I'm not bothering anyone." "You're not supposed to be here," the officer snapped. "I already told you to leave." The young woman stood up, her coffee in hand. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice steady but firm. The officer turned to her, clearly annoyed. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It does now," she replied. "He's just sitting here, writing in his notebook. How is that a problem?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" It was a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, his tie neatly knotted and his briefcase resting at his feet. He had been watching from a distance and decided to step in. His tone was calm but commanding, and the officer hesitated. "Not at all," the officer said after a moment. I was just reminding this gentleman that he can't loiter here. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. He's not loitering. He's sitting quietly, minding his own business. Last I checked, that's not against the law. The officer stiffened but didn't argue. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, his boots clicking against the floor as he retreated. The man in the suit turned to the homeless man and the young woman. "You okay?" he asked. The man nodded. "I'm fine." The young woman smiled at the man in the suit. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded and walked away, leaving them alone once more. For the first time, the man by the window seemed to relax. He looked at the young woman and gave her a small, almost grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shrugged, trying to play it off. "It's nothing," she said. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The officer